Welcome to Mid-Century Living, your weekly nostalgia podcast about the best of technology and culture from the mid-20th century.
Welcome to episode 23 of Mid-Century Living, the show where we talk all about the best of the mid-20th century and how to add vintage vibes to your modern life. We're your hosts, Jackie
and Gonzalo. Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about suburbia, or suburbs. But first, Jackie, how was your week?
My week was good. I, again, have nothing really super interesting to talk about except for I have decided to finally make fondue. I have 2 fondue pots that I bought just because they're cute, and I'm finally going to use one. So I just actually went today and bought all of the cheese and dippers and an entire yard of French bread. Because apparently baguettes, you have to buy them by the yard. Like, have they always been super? Like, it's the largest piece of bread I've ever seen. Like, I don't understand. I guess maybe they're thinking you're feeding more than 2 people with it. But anyway, so I got French bread, pears, little tiny meatballs, cornichons. I got broccoli and cauliflower that I'm going to roast for dipping. And I think that's everything. I was actually thinking about, like, we have some ham that I might also dip in cheese. What else do you think would taste good dipped in cheese?
Pretzels?
Like soft pretzels or like crunchy pretzels?
I think both. I was thinking the soft kind, like the Auntie Anne's type.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I wonder where I can go get soft
You can
pretzels.
buy the Auntie Anne mix at the store.
Yeah, I think they sell mixes for that. That would be good. But I already have an entire yard of French bread to use. Like,
I don't see the problem here.
I was also doing a lot of research on Swiss fondue, and apparently they're like... So the thing is, it has to be stirred constantly, which is why you're supposed to take turns dipping stuff in it, is because you're supposed to like spin everything around so that you're like constantly stirring the cheese. And also, if you drop your bread in the cheese, you have to kiss the host or something. I read some kind of like goofy tradition about it.
I had no idea.
But that might be from the weird section on like tea parties or something. I don't know. But
maybe.
Apparently there are...
We had cheese fondue as our first course for Christmas dinner this past year.
Oh, fun! I've never eaten it. I've been to like fondue restaurants, but I've done the thing where you like dip your meat in hot oil and cook it. Like, I've never done cheese fondue.
Oh, you never done cheese fondue? Oh, in those restaurants, you start with the cheese fondue. That's your first course.
Yeah, every time we've gone to them, we've just done the meat. I don't think we've ever done the cheese part.
Oh.
Or it's just that the cooking your own meat at the table is just so cool to me that everything else just fades to the background because I just think that's so cool. That's what I was originally going to do, but it also seems like super dangerous.
So my only recommendation for the cheese fondue making process is the pot you're going to use whenever you are making the cheese fondue. You really do have to stir it like hard and well.
Well, my plan was originally to like make the cheese fondue in like a nonstick whatever and then dump it into the fondue pot for serving. I wasn't gonna like cook the whole thing in there because I hear that takes a long time.
Yeah.
But I don't know, we'll see how it goes.
When you do that, here's another top tip. When you put it in the fondue pot, that pot that you used to make the fondue in, put it underwater.
Oh yeah. Every time I have to clean something that had melted cheese in it, I'm so mad, and I like wish I was lactose intolerant or something. Like, why do I do this to myself? It's such a pain in the ass to clean. But I think it'll be worth it.
That's why you go to Goodwill and you buy yourself the $2 pot that you can just throw out whenever you're done.
Yeah, we'll see. But anyway, that's my big exciting. So hopefully that'll be delicious. And that is all that's happening with me right now. What's happening with you?
Nothing food related, although I could go for some fondue right now. No, my week was pretty good. The only thing, we had a fight at school, which was interesting because I always hear about these things, but I never see them. But it happened in the hallway right outside my classroom, and I was coming back to my classroom from the copier, so I had a stack of papers in my hand, and I walked into the classroom, and then I heard noises, so I immediately turned around and went back outside without dropping my copies. So then, of course, the fight wasn't really a fight. It was more like the kids like posturing, if that's the word. Like they were like trying to be tough and stuff and yelling at each other while like charging. But the hallway's fairly narrow because it's a hallway. So like I ran outside. Well, I walked really quickly. I didn't run to the hallway. And another teacher was like, well, we should, she's like, we need to call security. And I was like, go, I'll I don't know, do something. I don't know what I was going to do. I'll just stand. So I just literally stood in the hallway trying to separate the two people who were trying to fight, but not really fighting because they were just not actually punching each other.
Oh, that's good.
And then that's it. And the worst thing of all is that when I went back to my classroom, all the papers that I had just made copies of were all crumpled.
Aw.
Everyone was fine. Let me just preface with that, okay?
Yeah, everyone. Yeah,
Everyone
it sounds
was
like it
fine.
could have
There
been
was-
a lot worse than that.
Well, there was no actual fight.
Good.
It was just like yelling. Like in the movies, whenever people fight in schools, there's actual fighting. There was no fighting. It was just yelling.
That's
It was
good.
just kids being loud, which then caused me to crumple up all the fresh copies I had just made.
Sad.
So that was my week.
That's pretty exciting. I'm glad it wasn't worse.
Yeah, I'm glad so too.
But perhaps the fight was not so bad because it took place in the suburbs.
I'm liking this transition. Yes.
So, Gonzalo, both you and I grew up part of our lives in the stereotypical American suburbs, but did you ever really think about that was where we were living?
No. I mean, beyond, hey, I live here and I go to school here and let's go to the coffee shop to get some coffee and that kind of stuff. I do remember like our drives to the city
Mm.
when we would like go to like the coffee shops in the city because I was like not the suburbs. And then I remember also when I finally moved to the city and I would go to those same places and I'm like, this is not the city. It's just halfway between the suburbs and the city.
It felt like the city to us.
I did. But I guess we should probably start with what is a suburb, right?
Right.
So picture a suburb in your head. What do you see?
A bunch of houses that look the same next to each other.
Yeah, pretty much, right? So when people think of the burbs, the suburbs, right? A lot of times they picture a little housing community outside of the city center, full of tree-lined streets, charming houses sitting side by side, which might sound a little cliche, but the general idea is pretty accurate. The suburb is actually it's a smaller part of a larger city or larger town. It tends to be a smaller community that is adjacent or within a short commute of a city. And the main characteristic is that it is usually the residential area and where the majority of a city's workers actually live.
Hmm.
Yeah. So since I'm a little history teacher, I have to bring a little history fact into this podcast episode. So while the suburb really came to its own during the mid-century, there is a clay tablet from Persia from 539 BCE that alludes to the suburbs existing in Mesopotamia. So again, sorry, I'm a little nerdy here, but I have to talk about ancient civilizations.
Of course.
So the tablet says, quote, "Our property seems to me the most beautiful in the world. It is so close to Babylon that we all enjoy the advantages of the city. And yet when we come home, we stay away from all the noise and dust." End quote.
Oh, yeah, that sounds just like today.
Yeah, so there's really something about that. It kind of hits all the points of a suburb. It's quiet or away from the city noise, at least. All the issues from the city are gone, but it's still close enough that you can enjoy the city itself. So there's some evidence of suburbs also in pre-war cities. Ancient Rome, which is very pre-war, I guess pre all the wars. Ancient Rome had areas created for citizens of lower class that were outside of the city. Once streetcars become a thing, so fast forward several hundred years, we start seeing them in places like Montreal, Canada, where they were called the streetcar suburbs. But suburbs really became a thing through the process called suburbanization, which is the population shift from the core city into the suburbs, which a lot of people also know as urban sprawl.
Yes, I've heard of that.
And possibly one of the biggest factors in the creation of the suburbs was the innovation by Henry Ford of the assembly line. For those of you who, I think we covered this in our electric car episode, but assembly line made car manufacturing a streamlined process that resulted in many more cars, which then led to lower cost of cars, making them available to more people, which in turn led to more people having the ability to drive. And because suburbs by nature are far from the city, those who live in suburbs needed the vehicles to make it to the city where the jobs were at. So basically, the more cars we had, the more that people could drive, the further away from their job they started moving to. And local governments also spurred the creation of suburbs because they often made it cheaper for someone to go and develop vacant land outside of a city rather than to improve on an existing structure.
Makes sense.
And also, larger governments like state and federal governments also had incentives for people to move to these new areas or the new suburbs through the introduction of things like loans and subsidies for those willing to move further away from city cores and build.
And this is all probably an excuse to to not improve the city buildings.
Yeah. Well, for whatever reason, it was made harder and more expensive to fix existing structures than it was to go and develop land.
Neat.
So, moving on to post World War's expansion, the GI Bill, or also as it's known, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, which was established to help veterans of World War II. Um, Apart from helping establish hospitals, grant stipends and tuition expenses, and help provide employment and education to war veterans, it also provided low interest mortgages, which then, coupled with a large group of people, the veterans and their families, who could suddenly afford to purchase a house away from the city, spurred on the creation of or the expansion of suburbia. So, between all this and then the Highway Act of 1956, which helped fund the building of almost 40,000 miles across the USA, we started seeing a housing boom.
Cool.
Side note, the article I read said Highway Act of 1956, which helped build blah, blah, blah kilometers of highways. And I go, why kilometer? This is a USA thing.
You're talking about the US.
Yeah, so I had to go in there. And
we don't have kilometers here.
Yeah, I had to go and convert it to miles.
That's funny.
Yeah. Anyway, it created a housing boom. Now, again, it's a combination of the post-war legislation, more cars available, and then as population grew, combined with families and their saving habits of the war, people started saving a lot more money. So between 1946 and 1955, almost 1.5 million non-farm housing units were built, compared with just over 300,000 between 1935 and 1945. And the ability to purchase a house became a reality for most people. The average price of a house was $7,300, which in today's dollars means the average house was about $85,000.
Dang.
I know. Compared to the actual median cost of 2024, which is $412,000.
That is crazy.
Yeah. So developers began to purchase empty land outside of cities and installed tract housing based on a just handful of designs. And this helped keep prices down by using standard size equipment and appliances, making it possible to mass produce. So pretty much here we started seeing things like the Frigidaire flare, which we talked about in our previous episode, being installed in houses.
Yeah. And they made everything 30 inches wide on purpose because apparently when people designed kitchens, they just left a 30-inch hole where the range was supposed to go.
Yeah.
Yep.
Did you ever watch Little Shop of Horrors, by the way?
Oh, geez, not in 100 years. I've been meaning to rewatch it like every year. I think, gee, I should rewatch that, and I haven't in forever.
I don't know if you remember. There's a song where one of the characters talks about her fantasy of living away from Skid Row in the city.
Is
and
it
the song
Audrey?
goes, yes.
Because he names the plant after her, and that's why the plant is Audrey too.
Yes. Anyway, the song goes on to talk about a house with a grill out on the patio, disposal in the sink, washer and dryer with an ironing machine, which I always thought was funny. Somewhere that's green. That's what the song's
That's
called.
the name of the song, yeah.
Yeah.
That's coming back.
It also has a line, though, that says, before she starts singing, she goes, when she's talking about her fantasy, she's like, not fancy, like Levittown. And I never knew what that meant until I was researching for this episode. But Levittown is the name for many large suburban developments in the USA, created by a man named William J. Levitt and his company Levitt and Sons. And these were communities of houses which offered attractive alternatives to overcrowded and cramped cities for returning white veterans and their families. And between Veteran Affairs, the VA, and the FHA, which is the Federal Housing Administration, Levittown homes were guaranteed to cost less for veterans than rental costs in a city. The first Levittown homes were sold for around $7,900, and about 17,000 units were sold in a very short period of time.
So, adjusted for inflation, $7,900 in 1950 is about the same as $101,000 in 2024 dollars.
Yeah, which it's still lower than the average house.
Way lower.
Yeah. What's even crazier, though, is that in March 1947, when the original Levittown homes began to be sold, 1,400 homes were purchased within the first 3 hours.
Yeah, jeez.
So, yeah.
Well, with those prices.
I know. So Levittowns were the stereotypical early suburbs. When you think of 1950 suburbs, you probably have an image of Levittown in your heads.
Honestly, I picture Edward Scissorhands if I'm thinking 1950s suburbs. That's what like pastels, like that's what I'm picturing.
Yes, and that's also what I think of whenever I think of suburbs, like early mid-century suburbs. But that's not very far off from what a Levittown was.
Hmm.
The home building process was modeled on the assembly line. Again, thanks Henry Ford. And it was built in 27 steps by construction workers, each trained to perform one step, which meant that one house could be built in one day with 36 people or 36 men.
Wow.
Yeah. And this enabled quick and economical production of identical homes with rapid recovery costs, meaning it was very easy for the builders to build houses, sell them at a price that would then recover the cost of construction.
Cool.
And standard Levittown homes included a white picket fence, green lawns, and modern appliances, just like in Little Shop of Horrors.
Adorable.
The first Levittown was in Levittown, New York, circa 1947, followed by Levittown, Pennsylvania in 1952. And there were also Levittowns in New Jersey, Maryland, and even Puerto Rico.
Interesting. I love that he just uses the same name everywhere, but I guess he's working on a brand.
Yeah, I guess he's a 1950s version of an influence. So Levittowns were not without controversy. William J. Levitt refused to sell homes to non-Caucasians, and the FHA kind of helped with that. They included some covenants in each deed, making each Levittown pretty much segregated communities. The first black family to move into a Levittown, the Myers, who bought a second-hand house in Levittown, Pennsylvania in 1957, experienced attacks on their house and up to 500 people gathering outside their home. So it's not very pleasant. Also, one of the ways that suburbs expanded so quickly, not exactly the nicest thing back in the 1950s and 1960s. What happened was as cities or as urban areas became more racially diverse, we had people who were leaving to the suburbs to create their own little communities, and those were typically those with European ancestry, so white people who were of European descent, who moved to out to the suburbs to create little communities, and then when those became more diverse, they would move further out to make more communities. So this created these ex-urban regions of suburbs, which were ethnically homogenous. Which is not the nicest part of history, but we need to acknowledge that it's stuff that happened that should not have happened, or hopefully does not happen today.
Indeed.
Now it's more about gentrification, and
Yeah, because now they're going back to those urban places, and yeah,
people are like, well, we can't keep moving further and further out because my job is still in the city. So then they start reclaiming the cities.
So, how many people live in the suburbs, or how much of America is covered in suburbs?
So technically, cities are legal designations, right? They have areas that have specific public powers and functions, but many of largest American cities don't feel like cities, especially when you think of like our bohemian dreams of Chicago and New York. Large parts of many big cities are residential neighborhoods of single-family homes, and are as car dependent as any suburb. But the last census, the population of the country's biggest cities grew almost 1% in 2014. But city growth doesn't always mean urban growth.
What does that mean?
So when a city grows, it doesn't necessarily mean that the urban areas grow. Like, because there's no specific...
Oh, you mean like no new buildings are popping up, it just means more people are moving there?
No, it's not necessarily that. It's that because the legal designation of what a city is versus what a suburb is not a clear black and white line. When census data and American data says that urban growth is happening, doesn't necessarily mean that residential areas are getting smaller and urban parts are getting bigger. And it doesn't also mean that it's just urban that's growing. The cities are growing, and there's no clear cut data that says out of that, this much is residential only, this much is suburbs.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, census data makes it sound like the cities are growing, but most of
But
the
really, they mean the whole city area, including the houses around it.
correct. Yeah, the official data doesn't differentiate between the two. The data that we have that says this many people live in urban versus suburb are all down to the person who fills out the census.
Okay.
Yeah. So like the census data shows almost 80% of population living in urban areas, which means just not countryside, not rural. The data combines what people describe as where they live in, which people describe that they live in 26% urban, 53% suburban, and only 21 rural.
Interesting. So it doesn't actually say what a suburb is, though. Like, how do people know if they're living in a suburb versus not?
Correct. Again, it's down to the person who's filling out the paperwork. Yeah, and it's down usually to what people think of how dense their zip code is. Typically, if you have more than 2,000 households per square mile, you're in an urban city. If you have less than 100, you're rural. And if you're in the middle, guess what? Suburban.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So qualities of a suburb, something that's not exactly a like must have, but this is what all suburbs are like. There's a lot of space. So because you're not bound by city blocks or dense or the density of city living, you typically have much more space in a suburb. Typically, a house with a patio and lawn, or apartments which are typically larger and have better rent prices. It's a lot of common amenities, usually closer to things like grocery stores, gas stations, and coffee shops. So everything's in a community, which you can also find in urban areas, but in a suburb, you're not typically within walking distance of those things.
So true. And it makes sense that this was kind of inspired by cars, because a lot of this stuff you can't really pull off without owning one.
Yeah. You do get larger houses. So, yes, you can own property in a city, but houses are typically smaller or more space efficient. Whereas in suburbs, you typically get more space for your money. And there's also a different sense of community, I guess you should say. A lot of times, suburbs are much closer as far as liking the people near you. A lot of bonding with neighbors is common, more peace and quiet, usually less crime. I'm still in all my time living in suburbs in the Americas. I'm still waiting for that block party that you see in movies.
Yeah. When we moved into our house, though, our neighbors brought us like flowers and fresh fruit as like a welcome to the neighborhood gift, which was really sweet.
Oh, that's cool. No one welcomed me.
Aw.
Okay, okay. So when we moved to the States and we moved to the suburbs, the neighbor across the street, her name was Donna, and I remember because I thought her name was Donut. But I was little. Anyway,
Right.
she came over to introduce herself to the new neighbors, and then we lived in that house for like 3 years. Never once again saw her.
Aw.
As far as I know, that house was empty. Like the only way you could tell people lived in it was sometimes there was a car in the driveway.
Yeah, that happens.
Yeah. So Jackie, is your house in the suburbs, or
It
is
is
it still
definitely
technically
the
the city?
It is definitely the suburbs. I am quite a bit of ways away from downtown Dallas, actually. And I love that you said new house. I guess it's new to me house because it's a 1956 house.
Yeah.
What about yours?
So yes, I am definitely in the suburbs. Not. I'm in like an inner suburb. I'm not as far out as where we grew up, but I'm not far from that either. But if you had told me in high school that I would have lived in a suburb as an adult, I probably would have laughed at you.
Yeah, I know. When I was like in high school, I always thought I would be like really bohemian and cool and live in the city forever.
I know, me too. I was like, I'm gonna move to New York and have a loft apartment with big windows and a door that slid on the wall. And when my friends came over, we're gonna sing about how great life is and how rent's expensive. Because basically it was rent.
Right. But no, dreams
Yeah.
change.
Yep. But now that we are caught up to the present and we've gone a little bit through memory lane to our suburb experience, it is time for our etiquette segment. Jackie, what do we have today?
So today I decided to go for something that I don't know anything about, which is Chapter 18, What's What in Various Sports. So, sporting related etiquette. Mostly I'm very out of the loop. If I recall correctly, I think football just ended and baseball's next.
You are correct.
Okay. But anyway, so since I know nothing about sports, I thought this section was interesting. She actually has, again, this is from Amy Vanderbilt's Guide to Etiquette from 1957. She has whole sections on dress and rules of behavior for golf, tennis, badminton, yachting, swimming, hunting, shooting, fishing, skiing, and skating specifically. But I pulled all of this from the more general section called Customs, Dress, and Taboos in Other Sports.
Ooh.
So, according to Amy Vanderbilt, sportsmen have very stiff notions of what constitutes a gentleman, and unless you know these customs, you may be guilty, in your enthusiasm over a sport new to you, of offending or being classified as a bore rather than, more fairly, as a mere ignoramus.
Sorry.
Apparently, sportsmen are notably intolerant about nonconformist behavior. So, in playing all games and sports in a team or a group, you must abide by the accepted rules, unless, of course, the majority of players agree to relax the rules in some way. For example, Amy Vanderbilt brings up that her own badminton court, I guess she has a group of friends who play badminton, or did.
Oh, see, I thought like, in my house, my personal badminton court, like something that everybody has in their
I'm
house.
assuming these are people going to badminton places. Because it kind of makes sense later, but her group of friends that play badminton together regularly prefer to score in the manner of ping pong rather than regulation scoring, and they do this on purpose because they think ping pong scoring speeds the game up and is easier to keep track of. But on neighbors' courts, where the usual rules are well established, we follow them and allow the host the privilege of keeping the more complicated score.
Oh, that's cool. So like house rules.
Yeah, house rules. So, some other random etiquette for other sports. So, swimming. You do not swim beneath the diving board for reasons that should be perfectly obvious, or jump off into the midst of water treading or floating bathers. Instead, you slip off backwards to create the least possible splash.
Interesting. It's funny. So I coach swimming, and we have diving boards at our pool, and I had them closed off so that no one swims under them.
So that's still a rule then?
Yeah, but I just did it because I was afraid someone was gonna jump off the edge of the pool
And then land on a human? Yeah.
No, just not see the diving board and then jump into the diving board. So I lifted ours up so they're at an angle.
Yeah, that's smart. She has this like really kind of rude section that I included, but now I'm not sure. But anyway, so on most beaches, bathing trunks without tops are now permitted. She's talking about men. As are the briefest of trunks. A man should be perfectly objective about his figure, however, before choosing his attire.
I mean, I don't know. Do you want me to tell you? I mean, I've got some short type swimming trunks.
I think she's just... I'm not sure. It's kind of sizist, but also it was 1957.
I mean, I don't like wearing... I don't like wearing the trunks that go so close to your knee. Like when I was at the my cruise last summer, yes, it was in Alaska, but I still went to the pool, and my trunks are mid thigh or higher.
Well, that's the thing is like I've heard men in my life complain about how unfair it is that women can just wear short shorts and everything, and like in the 80s and in the 70s and 60s and everything, like men's shorts were actual shorts, and somewhere around the 90s they decided that men basically need to be wearing long pants at all times even when it's 110 degrees out. Like,
yeah, no,
those swim trunks are totally impractical. Like, why should you be uncomfortable for fashion?
No, who wears short shorts? I wear short shorts.
Yeah, so there's more swimming etiquette that she includes. So, swimming in the same ocean does not give a man the right to force his conversations or attention on other swimmers or sunbathers.
Oh, I like that.
Exhibitions of water splashing, wrestling, and sand throwing, often engaged in by very young men to attract feminine attention, usually make them offensive in the very eyes of those they seek to attract. So, that's good advice as well.
I like how she words that, because in my mind it's like I don't know, like the savannah, like like
Like
people
mating
like
rituals.
yeah, but I'm like I don't know if anybody who like goes to the beach and starts throwing sand and splashing water to attract the attention of the opposite sex. It's
I
usually
mean,
just to
maybe
be
16-year-olds, but who knows?
maybe.
So she has another couple of general sporting tidbits. Basically, the consensus is that or what she's basically summing up is that there are various sports that have unwritten rules and that you should be mindful of them. For some examples, like in deer shooting season, you must not wear white because it might be mistaken for that little patch of white on a deer's tail.
Oh,
Uh,
okay, smart.
she added this interesting bit about if you're bagging small game, determine the legal limit before setting out and stay within it. It is not good sportsmanship to go over the permitted limit, even when there's little possibility of being caught.
Hmm.
But like, don't break the law is, I think, slightly more than etiquette. And also this interesting thing about never reeling in a fish without playing him on the line. You're supposed to give him a sporting chance to escape first.
Interesting. I find fishing boring, but I would imagine that if you're fishing, your aim is to fish the fish.
Right, but
Like
apparently it's proper etiquette to give him a chance to escape. Like,
that
you have to
just
really win.
it just seems like, I don't know, rude to the fish. Like you're playing with your food before you eat it.
You are playing with your food.
It's like, I'm gonna get you, fish.
So what do you think of these etiquette tips?
I like them. I like that there's like, I don't know. I love the idea that like, okay, you don't have to conform to like scoring conventions of actual professional sports if you're not a professional sport player.
Mm-hmm.
So like, what's it matter if you keep badminton score in your friendly game with your friends different than what professional badminton players keep it? As long as you're having fun,
Mm-hmm.
do as you wish.
Yep, I love that.
So I say yes.
I think most of these are pretty standard. Yeah, and the house rules thing about just as long as everyone agrees that these are the rules you're following, then you're playing it right, as long as everyone agrees.
Yeah.
Other than the weird thing about playing with your food and the fishing, I think most of these are pretty good advice.
Yeah,
So,
because if by that logic, am I supposed to like, when I go hunting, which I don't go hunting, but if I was to go hunting, am I supposed to like shoot my gun near the deer to scare it off into running away and then shoot the deer?
so I skipped over this, but it says that in shooting small game, you're not supposed to fire until the birds are on the wing, and you're never supposed to shoot down a treed animal or one in cover, because it's not sportsmanlike either.
Okay, so that answers my question. You're supposed to let the bird fly away before you shoot it down.
Yep.
Okay.
Apparently
So
that's the sportsman thing to do.
So allow your prey to run away and then shoot it in the back.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Uh,
This is why I don't go hunting.
yeah.
But I like it. I will be okay with giving this the seal of approval, the mid-century seal of approval.
Yeah, mostly I think this is interesting because I don't do anything sporty, including every single one of these activities are not activities that I do. Well, I do occasionally swim, but it did seem like she said most of the etiquette rules were about men not being splashy.
Yes.
So that's not my problem, I guess. But no, I think these are all pretty timeless etiquette tips.
Oh, I agree.
So approve.
Awesome. Well, it looks that with that approval, we have landed the plane. So thank you guys all for listening today. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to the show and tell a friend.
You can also follow us on Instagram at MCL Podcast. This is the best place to send us feedback and episode suggestions, so you can send us a DM anytime.
Yep. So thanks for listening, guys. We'll talk to you again next week.
Bye!
Thank you for listening to Mid-Century Living. Please subscribe, tell your friends, and leave a review. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at MCL Podcast. See you next Friday.